our roundtable on debt and the deficits. Today, the knights of our roundtable are Professor Jim Rock, Professor Bill Carlisle, and Professor Korkut Erturk with the University of Utah Department of Economics. We know that governments have deficits, and deficits are when they spend more than what they collect in taxes. And when government runs deficits, that means they're accumulating a debt. And periodically, governments always run deficits. But since the 1980s, the United States has run chronic deficits. Why have these chronic budget deficits generated such concern? And I'd like to start with you, Professor Rock.
Thank you, Mary. I'm Jim.
Okay.
The deficits are something that happens usually from wartime. But more recently, since the 1930s, we've had deficits because our perspective as to what our civilization, our society should be like has changed. So instead of the government only worrying about protecting our lands from others, we also worry about people within our society who don't have the wherewithal to take care of themselves. And so deficits, if they are used in some way to make our society better, are perhaps an advantage, and in some way are building human capital. And we should think of them as a way of making our society a better society in the future. If, in fact, the deficits are spent in ways in which the money is wasted, just like if we were a household and we wasted money, it is money down a rat hole. The same thing can happen as far as the government is concerned. So I think when you look at a deficit, the thing to think about is the money being spent the way you wish it to be spent. And as voters, what we should do in terms of a political framework is to think, are the people in Congress or the president or others who are spending our money, are they spending it the way we would like them to spend it?
Well, it seems to me, though, that people don't seem to be happy with the way government's spending money. And you're saying that has an effect on whether the deficit is good or bad. So can you tell me, what does government spend money on, and how does that affect our economy in terms of our growth, our trade deficit, interest rates? Can you tell me more about this, maybe Professor Carlisle?
If people aren't happy with the way government is spending the money, then that's going to imply to the entire government budget and really does not relate to the deficit. I think that if people are happy with government spending, the kinds of programs that are being provided, then that's not completely related to the deficit. And if they're unhappy with government spending, then it would be related to the entire government budget, and the deficit is something of an independent issue. I think the reason that people are deeply concerned about the deficit is essentially because the balanced budget orthodoxy was so strong prior to 1940 that there's still that particular line of thinking in people's minds, and they worry extensively about the deficit, and perhaps much more than they should. One reason for that is that government budgeting is not carried out properly. They don't carry capital accounts and current accounts and bonding for capital expenditures.
What's a capital account and what's a current account? Can you?
Well, if the government budget were organized in a way that you had current spending, such as spending for day-to-day things by the government.
As a corporation would do it.
Just as a corporation would do it. And if there were capital budgeting that implied budgeting for building buildings or building dams or other long-lasting government capital, then with those two separate accounts, and if you identified bonding associated with the capital account, I think people would worry a lot less about the deficit, because much of the deficit could be attributed to government capital spending. But because the government doesn't keep the accounts that way, the deficit looks like it's just a current account deficit. People compare that to their own household expenditures problem and come up with an analogy that suggests that the deficit must be intrinsically bad because of all of this debt and debt creation. A deficit might be bad or it might be good, but it can't be resolved on the basis of current budgeting approaches because of this absence of a capital account and current account separation.
Okay, now,
if I may add a moment to that, one of the other things that is not taken into account is that for the national government and also for corporations is that they don't go through a lifespan in which we're going to die sometime. And so as a household, we do that and we save so that we've got something when we quit working or what have you for our retirement. The government doesn't have to do that. And for that
Well, we're
reason,
lucky they live forever.
that's right. They live forever.
Okay.
And, well, at least it's been over 200 years. And that is somewhat amazing in the world that we have, is that we have had a government that lived that long and is continuing to live. And part of it is the idea that we worry about our society and that we worry about other people. And we have not had revolutions, either from people who were disaffected on the lower side, or from people on the higher side who felt that they deserved it. And so I think the democracy is a very important part of the way in which we run our government, and we should realize that what we are always looking to the future. And one of the problems then that comes up in political rhetoric is this idea that we don't want to give our children a debt. But our children and before us have had debts, whether it is from the war or from other reasons, and as long as the purpose of the debt is a good one. And if you're a household, if you buy a house, you're in debt. Or you buy a car, you're in debt, and you think that's good. If you go into war and you win the war, you think that's a good thing. Or you build the space module, or you do something else which you think is going to be beneficial in the future, then it's probably a worthwhile debt.
Okay, now from what I hear you saying, deficits aren't bad as long as we spend the money wisely on things that we actually want to have and want our children to have in the future.
Exactly.
On investment in capital goods, a better society. But I have this question, why do people say, though, that deficits are bad? I mean, can I ask you, Professor Erturk?
Sure.
What are these arguments people make?
Well, there are a number of them, but I think we have to realize that people feel deep unease about their economic situation. That's a fact of life. And very few people really know much about economics, including a lot of economists. And there is one thing that just is so evident, the growing budget deficit. So there is this simple arithmetic that goes through a lot of people's minds. They know, that's a fact, they know in their lives that economic situation has indeed worsened, and the budget deficit increased approximately in the same time span. So there is this easy logic which equates that the economic problems kept getting worse as budget deficits seem to start getting out of hand. Now, there's really nothing to it when you look carefully, but there's that type of a confusion. I think a second confusion is that we're living in a very complicated economy, which seems to be changing faster. Technological changes not only pervasive, but has become terribly unpredictable. This means that certain types of skills, certain types of professions become rapidly obsolete. And this makes everyone uneasy in the sense that no one has any meaningful sense of job security. Now, these are the result of very complex processes. Now, I think, again, an easy way out of this difficult and complex process, making sense of this difficult and complex process, is to give this excessive credit to what governments can do and blame the government. It's not the government. Governments do play an important role, no doubt, but in the overall scheme of things, in terms of where this economy, which can be likened to a big ocean liner, what the governments can do is quite limited. I think the system has its own, if you like, laws of motion, and has its own direction, which has to do with very complex technological issues and what have you. And the governments don't play that much of a role. We wish they did.
Okay, in fact, speaking of one of these roles of the government and the deficit on the private sector, we often hear and read about in our texts that when a society saves, those savings get into the financial system, and then private companies can access those savings for investment in plant and equipment, creating jobs. And what the budget deficit does is the government also needs to borrow those savings, and so they put their hand into the pot, pull it out, and that leaves less for the private sector. And we call this crowding out. And we're supposed to see it either in terms of slower investment, which is where we get our jobs and our growth, or in terms of higher interest rates, which is how we buy our houses and our cars and also how firms invest. And this idea of the budget deficit crowding out and slowing down growth would actually mean our children would be worse off because they have less in the future because we're not accumulating as much now. Can you comment on whether or not crowding out actually occurs? I mean, this is the theory, and does it actually occur in our economy, and is it related also to our trade deficit? That's a big question, but I'll start with Professor Rock.
Thank you, Mary. It is a big question, and I think there are a couple of underlying things that perhaps we should cover first. One is that our debt and deficit are usually put on television or on the radio newspapers in nominal terms. And we, in fact, have just come to a period when we had to increase the debt ceiling. And I think that that's what gets people's anxieties, that we have a nominal amount of money that we have as a debt limit. And we know that as prices change and we have some inflation, that we're going to always exceed that. And so this comes up, and I think it re-triggers in people's ideas that the debt is growing dramatically. And I think what we really should look at is, in fact, the GNP or the GDP ratio with debt. And if you look at the ratio, we can see, yes, there has been a dramatic change from the 1980s, where we went from something like 25 or 27% that debt was of GDP. And now it's about 50, but it's been, in the last 5 years, it's been about 50. And so we had a period in which we cut taxes, increased military spending, and we ran up a big debt. And so the change that took place up until about 1988 or so is something that we're still carrying forward. And so we've been at this ratio, which has remained very constant, but we keep on getting this feeling that things are getting worse because things are in nominal terms, and we should be looking at them in ratio form. So I'll let, seeing that other people haven't talked about this question, I'll pass that on to Bill, and maybe he's got something to say.
The question of this crowding out.
Yeah.
The crowding out issue, I think, is one of the potential real issues that one could talk about in the context of the deficit. Although I think that if that were modified by the idea that government debt tends to fund government capital, that the crowding out problem would be much less too. But one way of thinking about it is that there is a certain pool of borrowable funds in the economy, and if the government borrows a lot of those funds, then there are fewer funds available for private corporations to borrow. And in some general theoretical sense, there might be a constraint on private borrowing if public borrowing were so massive. The problem is that in the 1980s, even when the deficit was very large, the crowding out problem did not seem to emerge, that corporations seemed to be able to borrow the amount of money that they needed to fund their capital expenditures. Government indeed was borrowing a lot of money with large deficits in the worst years amounting to about $250 billion. So crowding out, I think, is a potential problem, but it seemed not to be a real problem in the 1980s, that private capital formation proceeded in a fairly strong way. And if one viewed this as public capital formation proceeding in a strong way as well, it would seem much less alarming. I think one reason that people are bothered by the deficit is from what Jim was saying. The deficit is portrayed in the media as being a runaway deficit, an explosive deficit, very large magnitudes of deficit spending in the 1980s, and that it's understandable why that was bothersome to people. It's just put out as a raw number and much larger than previous deficits. But with considered view of what it's gone to, particularly if one takes the view that it's gone to the formation of public capital, it would seem much less alarming. There is one other problem associated with a deficit that might be real, and that is that with a rising deficit and a rising debt, or even with a falling deficit, that still implies rising debt, that interest payments as a proportion of the total government budget grows. And that's another factor that has bothered people, that the interest obligation from year to year on government debt has seemed large to people, and it has seemed like a growing proportion. I think that does have a potential problem of edging out other types of useful public spending when a larger amount has to go to interest spending. But one of the raw facts is that the interest itself is paid to largely domestic holders of the debt, and so it's not a drain on the economy. It's a redistribution of funds, that funds are then spent by receivers of interest on the debt, including pension funds, including banks that hold government securities, and a wide variety of other entities that hold government securities. So the interest payments turn out to be a transfer. It is true that in a context where it is difficult to raise taxes, and one might agree that we're in an environment where it's difficult to raise taxes, then this may have a tendency to edge out other forms of important public spending. But that's a very different proposition from saying that all of these interest payments in some sense represent a drain on the economy. Mm-hmm. They don't represent a drain on the economy at all.
What proportion of these interest payments stay in the United States and what go overseas to foreign holders of the debt?
The estimates that I've seen suggest that about 15% of the national debt is held abroad. So there is some proportion of the interest payments that flows abroad. That becomes a problem that has to be handled in the structure of the balance payments. It's been basically a minimal problem. That does not constitute a major problem associated with the debt, that it's a matter of just balance of payments, flow of funds. Some come from other countries to us. We send funds from our country abroad. And not sending funds at all, it's often a matter of sending debits and credits. That too does not really represent a drain on the national economy in some sense. It's a balance of payments problem that is handled in normal balance of payments fashion.
But don't you think, Bill, that when you're looking at the whole capital market, the fact that it is a worldwide capital market is one of the things that kept the interest rates down. And so that's the advantage. But on the other side is the very idea that there are foreigners who are holding our debt. I mean, my parents left me some land in Wisconsin, and there are organizations who are telling me don't sell that land to foreigners, as though they could pick up the sod in Wisconsin and take it wherever they wish.
Well, they could take the cows.
That's right. And in fact, I have written them because very often there are people who really believe in the market system. That and in any other case, they would say, yes, you should bargain for the best possible price. And I tell them that I will sell that land to whoever gives me the best possible price. It makes no difference. And what's nice about a piece of land, rather than a picture or something or technology or something that can be transported out of the country, isn't that they have it here. And one of the things in medieval times, the case for security and peace was that you married your sons and daughters to the neighborhood kingdoms, so that people own parts of the other countries. And in that way, you had that stability. So I think that part should be remembered, that the fact that assets within the United States are distributed around the world, as are assets in other countries distributed in the United States, is one of the things, probably primary things, that leads us to a more peaceful sort of society. The other part that Bill brought up is public goods, and I think that maybe you would like to explain a little bit more about public goods and how that it isn't just for wartime that we need public goods.
Well, no, I wouldn't like to explain that. Actually, because before we go on to that, I wanted to continue this line of thought, because you're all pointing to the role of foreign capital markets, the role of other countries, and how they relate to the United States trade deficit. So before we get on to public goods, I did want to ask, Oftentimes people say there's a twin deficit, the government budget deficit and then the trade deficit where we import more than we export. And many people say there's a relationship. And I was wondering if you can comment on what is that relationship that people suggest might exist. Professor Araturk, can you?
Sure. Let me just say one thing about crowding out. I didn't get my chance in that round.
Oh, okay.
In the crowding out argument, usually the argument is that you have this fixed pool of savings, and the more the government takes, the less is left over for private business. The problem with this argument is that the pie is not constant. When the government takes, it spends. When the government spends, the pie doesn't remain constant. So just as you can have crowding out, theoretically you can also have crowding in, meaning the amount of savings might actually rise and the net impact on private investors might be positive as a result of government spending. So this is some issue that economists are still debating, and in terms of the results of empirical research that is going full force, the jury is still out. There is no clear-cut evidence of crowding out. In fact, certain periods we have a clear-cut evidence of crowding in. So
would an example of that be when government spends on education, there's a available supply of more skilled labor for companies, and therefore companies' costs of production are lower because they don't actually do the training. I mean, they get subsidized by the government in terms of this education, and
sure,
that allows them to do other things.
I think that's an intangible, which is important. But even not taking into consideration those issues, which are becoming more and more crucial in this globalized economy, just looking at the simple-minded multiplier effects of government expenditures, you can get crowding in. But the issue you've raised is very important. We don't even get to look at those because in terms of studying them empirically, it's not very easy. I mean, what are the returns on investment on education? You can get so many different results empirically depending on the assumptions you make. But nonetheless, we know for a fact that investment in education is becoming much more crucial. And if I can just add something else, one of the reasons why Japan did so well since the 70s is because of the quality of the educational level of the lower half of its labor force. Yes, the U.S. education system does just the opposite. In terms of higher education, the U.S. probably still is the best in the world, but when it comes to educating its lower half of the labor force, it's not in the competition anymore. And I think the U.S. is paying a very dear price for that. That simply speeds up the flow of jobs, blue-collar manufacturing jobs, to the next newly industrializing countries. Now, coming to your question about the twin deficit.
Yes, because the trade deficits, people wonder about this because when you import more than you export for extended periods of time, you accumulate a debt to other countries. You owe more to them than what they owe you.
Right.
And right now, the United States is the biggest debtor nation. We owe more to the rest of the world than what they owe to us.
Right.
And I want to explore now that link with the budget deficit.
Right. This is a complex issue. You can look at it from a number of ways. The run-of-the-mill argument says that both type of deficits structurally cause one another. If you're running a big budget deficit, that lead to higher interest rates. The higher interest rates will lead to a higher value of the dollar, and the higher value of the dollar will lead to lower exports, higher imports, thus a higher trade deficit. If you have a large trade deficit that you need to finance, that means you need to have foreigners buying your bonds. That means you have to keep your interest rates high, right? You have to, in other words, reduce the price of the government bonds, which increases interest rates, and that has a negative impact on your budget deficit. That's the argument. That's the textbook argument, if you like, and there's a grain of truth to it, to a degree. But then one has to qualify that in a number of ways. First of all, the real trouble with running a trade deficit is if that leads to a confidence crisis. For instance, a country like Mexico cannot do what the U.S. does. That is, run significant trade deficits year in and out and survive. Why? Because people will have a confidence problem and they won't be willing to lend money. And as a result, there will be a severe crisis in Mexico or any other country for that matter. But the U.S. is special. So that's very crucial. And there is no sign of the fact that the size of the trade deficit, as long as the trend is not explosive, especially you have to look at this in proportional terms, as Jim and Bill have pointed out, as long as that proportion is not rising, I don't see an international crisis brewing in the horizon. So that's not really an issue. But it can become an issue. So the confidence is very crucial. And we had something of this in the late 1970s where there was a crisis with respect to the dollar and there was a run on the dollar. So that's the potential problem. Second important issue, and there are so many others, but this is the last one I'll cover. If you're able to run large trade deficits, people don't realize what kind of a big advantage that is. That means you have access to world savings.
And those world savings allow for us to invest in our own country.
And there is good deal of evidence that the structural leap in the United States, I mean, the United States is at the forefront of new emerging technologies. We could not have said the same thing in the early 80s, definitely not in the 70s. Now, there is reason to believe that, in fact, these trade deficits or the flow of foreign savings in the United States did play a positive role in financing these new waves of investments in technologies.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for joining us today. And
Thank you, Mary. Happy to be here.